Tonight on Nation to Nation, our political panel is fired up, and it has to do with Bill C-69. It'll change how energy projects are approved.
I think this bill needs to be killed. It is a no more pipeline bill. It will drive away investment. And
the Liberals say they're trying to fix a problem the Conservatives created, like when the federal court squashed Trans Mountain pipeline approval.
If you're for killing C-69, you're for that process that led to the TMX mess that Conservatives created.
It's now before the Senate and close to becoming law. But is it too late to be amended?
This bill can be fixed, and it can be fixed with good amendments, and I hope it will be.
I'm Todd Lamourant, and welcome to Nation to Nation. On Tuesday, the federal government finally tabled its Indigenous Languages Act. Introduced by Canadian Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez, it aims to preserve and revitalize languages. Métis and First Nations leaders were on hand to support the bill. However, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Natan Obed expressed disappointment, saying it had been developed behind closed doors and is being imposed by a colonial system. To discuss it more, we're joined by our political panel of MPs. First up is Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, and the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Cathy McLeod. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller, I guess I'll start with you today. How did you address the concerns that the Inuit brought up a couple of days ago?
Well, look, certainly I can't speak for their views on language preservation for their people. They have their views. As we've seen in a number of these consultations, the needs are specific and unique in different communities. Very difficult for me to sit here and pass judgment on ITK's position on this bill. Certainly it's a view that we respect. But we look also to the resounding support that we've received for introducing this bill, which reaffirms inherent rights, the right to language under Section 35 of the Constitution for Indigenous peoples. Yesterday was the first step in redefining what this country is and what it purports to be. We are looking eventually to essentially have sufficient funding to support programs that are best administered by people who have been doing it in a countercurrent to what the government's been trying to do over decades and centuries, which is to extinguish it. So this is a first step, but also a very important first step in a process that will lead to Indigenous peoples revitalizing their languages in the way that they know best how to do it in their communities. So you will concede that this is very difficult to do in one bill. We've been able to capture the essence of it into this bill, but a lot remains to be done, and this does not by any means mean we will disengage from revitalizing and assisting in vitalization of Inuktitut and its dialects.
Minister Rodriguez at the press conference said that the bill could still be amended or changed. Of course, it's not going to a committee that you're sitting on. How do you foresee that happening?
So first of all, I want to say that the Conservative Party, through the residential school apology, we acknowledge the horrific destruction and pain that the loss of language and culture has, what it's left behind. And so certainly the fact that, government was part of the destruction means government must be part of the solution. So we are supporting this particular bill. I think certainly, obviously you always want to look at the goods and the bads. Like I look at, for example, S3, which was our gender equity bill, and certainly we recognize you had to respond for the court decision, but it wasn't till we got to committee that we recognized how many flaws were actually in the legislation. So certainly we think it's an important bill. We will certainly see it move forward to committee, and then we'll have an opportunity to hear from the people who are truly experts in terms of what's right and what's wrong.
Of course, the National Chief Perry Bellegarde really supported the bill because it made languages a constitutional right. Do you think the bill went too far, though, making something like language a constitutional right, though?
I suspect if you look at Section 35 of the Constitution, I'm not a legal expert, and I don't believe language rights have ever actually been tested in law, but if you look at what is Section 35 rights, I would not be surprised if it was tested in the courts that they would have done the same thing as this particular piece of legislation does. So again, I'm not a legal expert, and that's one of the things we want to hear from legal experts that will come to committee and talk about that particular component of it.
Mr. Miller, again, it looks like it was designed to survive, or at least Mr. Bellegarde said It's designed to survive changes in leadership, changes in government. Is that why languages are made a constitutional right in this piece of legislation?
It's important to kind of, in my mind, readjust the approach that we have to that particular statement. The legislation creates legal clauses, but it doesn't create the right to language. That right has existed as an inherent right for Indigenous peoples. It goes part and parcel as part of a very fundamental aspect of identity. Anyone that has seen the language conflicts that we've had in Canada, whether it's French or English, knows how important language, the ability to express yourself in your mother tongue, is to who you are as a nation and as a government. And so it's an essential step in self-government. It's an essential step for this government to express respect towards the peoples who haven't been receiving that respect, and quite the opposite for some time. And right or wrong, that we have created and we are responsible for, and that the church is responsible for, deliberately and through ignorance. And so we can sit here and talk about legal provisions, legal rights, but this is a day to affirm as a government that we support and we affirm the perfection of those rights, and that will go above and beyond the legislation. That includes stable financing, predictable outcomes, and really tests to vitalizations that I won't see in my time as a member of Parliament now, unless I last 30 years, the time to pass on from one generation to another. So in a way, this is very much about government, but it's also more importantly about Indigenous peoples reclaiming their languages that they're entitled to as an essential element of identity.
So I do want to just quickly note that I was at that Raising Voices Carriers of Hope, and the 13 to 17-year-olds that stood up, and you could see the pride as they were either fluent in their language or learning their language. And certainly everything indicates this is an incredibly important, and so certainly doing something to help preserve languages, protect languages, is something we should all strive for.
Of course, First Nations like to strive toward it being their languages be on a level like French and English, for example. Do you foresee that coming? I'll ask you, Mr. Miller, first. Will that happen, do you think, one day? Maybe not in your lifetime again in Parliament, but is that the goal?
The goal is for communities that desire to vitalize their languages, and indeed I would think it's all of them, to claim the rightful space that their language has in the way they communicate with each other, in the way they provide services. So in some sense, talking about that is an important element, but it's also a distraction, in my mind, to the most fundamental point, which is to ensure that these languages that have been shamed, that have been pushed down through government practice, are now vitalized, lift up, given the respect they're due, and the value that they have on this continent.
Ms. McLeod, again, kind of the same question. Does this mean that one day they'll be on a level playing field with French and English?
I always remember National Chief Bellegarde when he came to committee and he talked about the importance of language. And what he said is, our goal is not to have Cree on cornflake boxes. Our goal is to preserve and protect and to, enrich, have the enrichment that communities benefit from, seeing their culture, seeing their language revitalized. So I think he said it in terms of what, certainly the AFN's goals ultimately are.
Okay, well, it's going to be debated, of course, the rest of this week. I want to thank you for this topic, and we're going to move on. After the break, we talk about Bill C-69. It promises to change the way everything from pipelines to hydroelectric dams are approved. Welcome back. Bill C-69 is a sweeping overhaul of how energy projects from pipelines to dams are reviewed and approved. It's currently in the Senate, where Conservative senators have promised a robust review of it. Alberta and Saskatchewan want the bill killed outright. Indigenous groups who are for and against resource development both appear to have problems with the legislation. Once again, our political panel here is here to discuss. Ms. McLeod, what amendments are you hoping your Conservative colleagues do to this bill?
Not amendments. I think this bill needs to be killed. It is a no more pipeline bill. It will drive away investment. And as you indicated, First Nations that want to move forward with pipelines, want to move forward with opportunity, see real problems. And I want to go back. I mean, this is a bill looking for a problem that I think we can have a debate over when we changed the environmental legislation, it was about removing red tape. It was about facilitating projects going forward while ensuring environmental assessments were done properly. I don't think you can show me an example of where there was issues. I mean, consultation has always been an issue, and I think, finally we're getting that piece right. But I think if you look at the actual environmental assessment process, it's an absolute myth that what was happening before was not protecting our environment. So really, I think it's a bill looking for a solution where there was no problem, and really most people indicate it is just going to drive out investment, drive out opportunity, including for First Nations.
Have you got an indication from your Senate colleagues that that's what they're prepared to do?
I certainly can't speak for the Senate. I know the Senate always does their due diligence in terms of amendments. I mean, I think they recognize that the government has a majority, so certainly they are going to try and do everything that they can in terms of mitigating those horrific impacts. I don't think in Canada we shouldn't be ashamed of our natural resources. We shouldn't be ashamed of developing them. And we do have a good record in terms of our environmental protection. And we are getting better in terms of, First Nations and equity partnerships. And, the territories are doing some pretty good work in terms of what they're doing. So let's not destroy our opportunities in Canada by putting in place a bill that virtually scares away investors across the country.
Mr. Miller, does Bill C-69 do enough to not have a repeat of a federal court stepping in to stop a pipeline project like Trans Mountain if it gets passed?
Well, you're making a very important point, Todd. If you're for killing C-69, you're for that process that led to the TMX mess that Conservatives created. What industry is demanding is predictability in its investment. What banks that are financing these projects are demanding is predictability, and recognizing that the world and Canada is demanding rigorous environmental review. So this bill plugs a lot of holes that were created by the previous government, and it allows Indigenous consultation, reliance on science, and not some partisan approach that just jams things through. In a way, we're catching up with court judgments, and we're leading the way on the environment, cognizant of the fact that industry, international, domestic, is demanding these changes. So in my mind, and we'll let the Senate do its work, it's very important work to do. They're there for a reason, and it's composed of some brilliant people, and the government will absolutely look at anything that's proposed. But we need to have a process whereby industry can have predictable outcomes through a process that does not steamroll over Indigenous peoples, that does not steamroll over science. And we don't want the same result that the Conservatives created.
The predictable outcomes are going to be that there will not be another pipeline built in this country, which of course will hurt Indigenous peoples. And I absolutely agree that your government didn't learn from the Northern Gateway decision, which clearly articulated what you had to do around consultation. You didn't do that with Trans Mountain, in spite of the fact that you said you were going to. When you took over government, you said, we're reopening it up, we're going to do it properly. And you know what? We believed you. And when that court decision came down and it said, you didn't do the proper job, you didn't do any better than the Conservatives did, that was shameful. But to have a bill that is going to cut off opportunities for First Nations and Canadians across this country and say it's a good thing, I think is just so shameful.
Did you want to react to what
Ms.
McLeod just said?
Entirely entitled to her opinion. The process that was left to us by the previous government was wholly inadequate. The decision that came down on TMX was about the information that Cabinet received in order to take its decision. We've remedied that, and as I've mentioned in a previous show, this is an evolving body of law. But we undertook the Canadians to make sure that we had rigorous environmental assessments because people are demanding it, industry is demanding it, and this is the right thing to do. So there used to be a time where Conservative governments cared about the environment. They don't anymore. They just care about a shrinking base, and that's what they're going to play to for the next election. If you care about Canadians, you care about the environment, you care about the economy, and industry cares about it and has seen it, and banks won't invest unless they have that certainty. So this is a bill that, when it receives royal assent, will allow a review mechanism that is predictable for industry, and also respectful of science and Indigenous consultation.
So absolutely false that we do not care about the environment, but what we don't want to do is put in place a process that does nothing for the environment, but increases red tape across this country, and that's exactly what you're doing.
Ms. McLeod, I'm assuming, though, that if you want the bill killed, that you're fine with how the NEB goes about the way it approves projects.
So I think absolutely we heard from the decision around the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the decision around the Northern Gateway, which this government killed, that there is indeed better process that we need to do in terms of our consultation and accommodation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. Absolutely, that was very clear, but I think in terms of the processes that are in place, we have some of the best in the world, and people just don't appreciate how good our National Energy Board is, our provinces when they work with SIA in terms of doing assessments of mining projects. We have some really, I mean, I've been to the oil sands, I've looked at the reclamation areas where they have completely revitalized and the bison are back and the grasslands are growing again. We have really good processes in place in Canada.
Hey, Mr. Miller, the little time we have left, I'll give you the last word on this.
Oh, thanks. Look, this is an important bill for who we are as a nation. It's an important bill for industry because they demand it, Canadians demand it, and it will provide a way for us to assess programs that weren't properly assessed in the past and has resulted in the debacle that we've seen and had to deal with as a government. And we're prepared to move forward on something that is good for Canada, good for Canadians, whether that gets us votes or not.
Hey, Mr. Miller and Ms. McLeod, thank you again for doing this for me. Thank you.
Thanks.
After the break, more on Bill C-69 with Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Welcome back. When it comes to Bill C-69, Green Party leader Elizabeth May pulls no punches over where she stands on it. She's called it incredibly weak, tepid, and appalling. The bill is now before the Senate Committee on Energy, where it's possible it will be amended before being sent back to the House.
It's really essential to be able to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples up front, engage them in the process, and enable the definition, working with them, of an Indigenous engagement plan to ensure that any impacts are recognized, Indigenous knowledge considered, and that the Crown can consider accommodating, where possible, potential infringements on those rights.
But join me right now to discuss it is Elizabeth May. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Now, those are just a few of the words you used, but why is this piece of legislation so appalling to you?
To me, well, first of all, it's an omnibus bill, which means that omnibus meaning everything in it. Well, everything that's in this is the reforms to the National Energy Board, now to be the Canadian Energy Regulator. The promise that Trudeau made to repair the damage Harper caused to our environmental assessment process, that's the second part. The third part is overhauling the Navigable Waters Protection Act. These are three separate pieces of legislation. They should not have been bundled together, especially since they're long and complicated, and it meant that only one committee studied it. And I put forward 150 amendments that dealt with these three bills put together. So I can tell you, with the time allocation the Liberals put on it, really the Navigable Waters piece never got studied at all, really, and the amendments were just gavelled through. The worst part of it is clearly the environmental assessment piece, which is the middle one, which is what, when you'll recall, when Harper gutted the Fisheries Act and repealed the environmental assessment legislation we'd had since the Mulroney days, I replaced it with with basically a piece of legislation designed around pipelines and pipelines only. This bill basically keeps in place Harper's architecture of it's only about big projects. It doesn't bring back the environmental assessment we had from the pre-Harper days, and it worked pretty well then. So I was shocked that they ignored the advice of the expert panels, too. They had commissioned an expert panel on the NEB and an expert panel on environmental assessment, and then ignored the recommendations from those panels.
Now, for Indigenous people, the bill is supposed to make Indigenous participation easier. If you go on the government website, actually, on Bill C-69, it says that it clearly reflects the government's commitment to UNDRIP. I imagine you don't believe that's so.
Well, if they want C-69 to reflect a commitment to UNDRIP, then my amendments, and I put forward many, to ensure that the legislation was compliant with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a stated purpose of the Act to make it law. Every one of my amendments to make the NEB portion, the Canadian Energy Regulator, the environmental assessment portion, the Navajo Waters section. I put in amendments to say this will be compliant with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that was rejected at every time. There certainly is more reflection, and I give credit for more respect towards Indigenous knowledge, a place for bringing Indigenous knowledge into the process. But if the process is really poor, it's rushed, it still involves energy regulators like the NEB, like the offshore boards, like the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The process is so flawed that having better access to a flawed process that will only undertake reviews of a handful of projects is not an advance.
So it doesn't sound like, as you mentioned, a handful of projects. The Trans Mountain probably wouldn't have been one of those handful then.
Well,
so we probably wouldn't have avoided the court action that halted it?
Yeah. The weird thing is, okay, so if I go back to the very beginning of environmental assessment in Canada, in federal EA, in the 1970s, that was where we said, okay, if it's federal project, the federal government has to review its own projects. And this is really important to stress because federal has been understood to be federal land, federal money, or projects that require a federal minister to give a permit, like under the Fisheries Act or Navajo Waters. So every year up until Harper, the Environmental Assessment Agency would look at least a preliminary screening on up to 5,000 projects a year. What Harper did is say, no, we're not doing any of that. We're just going to have a project list, and we'll list the projects. And then if they're on the list, then they'll get environmental assessment. That shrunk it from about 5,000 a year to less than 100. And under Catherine McKenna's approach, the current Minister of Environment, it'll still be less than 100. It's a project list, which we still haven't seen, but it will be, as she has described it, the big projects. And a federal government project can cause damage to a fishery, can cause damage to an endangered species, even if it is relatively small. It can do large damage if it's in the wrong place. And under this legislation, most federal projects will never see a review. So that means Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples across the landscape who might want to raise an issue, because you know the land better than anybody, like it affects our trapline. Well, you could take that to court, but you're not going to have an initial environmental assessment where that issue can be raised.
We've got about a minute left, but I do want to ask this, as I mentioned in my intro, it's in the Senate right now. The Conservative Centre has promised a robust review. Does that mean you think any substantial amendments will end up coming out of the Senate?
Okay, so here's the weirdness of C-69. The pro-pipeline people have decided that this bill is a bill to stop pipelines because there's a lot of ministerial discretion. In other words, the Minister of Environment can step up at various points in the process and say, this project is approved or this project is turned down before the process of review is even complete. So that group, and I don't subscribe to any pro-fossil fuel infrastructure, pro-pipeline analysis, but the discretion that the minister can exercise, they assume will be used to stop pipelines. I look at it and say, why should there be ministerial discretion to that extent? You should make sure you've reviewed a project fully, and then a minister can make the ultimate decision. But there's no need of this kind of discretion. So on that, and on that only, I would agree with Conservative senators. This bill can be fixed, and it can be fixed with good amendments, and I hope it will be.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see. Ms. May, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you so much, Miigwech.
That's our show for this week. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.